When Jesus saw the crowd around... Wait, where am I? Yeah, that's right. Excuse me. When Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. Then a teacher of the law came to him and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." Jesus replied, "Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." I'm guessing he said this to this guy because this guy was not yet ready to leave everything behind for the sake of following Jesus. Jesus technically did have a place to lay his head. He had a house in Capernaum that he stayed at. But I think the point being made here is that this guy, whoever's talking to him, apparently was not yet ready to let go of his material possessions enough to become a true follower of Christ. Another disciple said to him, "Lord, first let me go bury my father." But Jesus told him, "Follow me, and let the dead bury their own dead." That's one of those things that you have to understand the context in which this was written, which again, the people who would have heard this spoken out loud to them for the first time would have known, because they would have lived in that context. We don't. We have a very different context for our burying the dead. So to us, this sounds really harsh. But again, it's basically saying don't let family matters become more important to you than your quest for the kingdom, your quest for Jesus. First of all, the guy's father may not have been dead. It's likely that his father actually was probably still alive. And secondly, they had a much longer burial process than we do. Okay, we basically spend a week or so in mourning, and then we have the funeral and the burial and all that. They had a longer process, which involved multiple stages, and we see it reflected at different points in the Gospels. Jesus' body, for example, when it was hanging up on the cross, was wrapped up and then put in his tomb. And the women were going there a few days later to kind of like properly anoint it with spices, because that wasn't done properly ahead of time. And then you would do that. You would put a body in a cave. You know, they had these family tombs, and you prepare the bodies with spices, which would mask the smell of decomposition as they decayed. And then you wrap it up. And then you put the body on a shelf in a cave that your family owned or somewhere. Then after the body had decayed, you would come back a year or two later and collect the bones and put them in a box and put them in a smaller shelf somewhere else. And then you'd have another, more room for another freshly dead body to be placed on the shelf that body had just been placed on. So there was a longer process of burial in that day and time. And so when you put a body in the ground, that wasn't necessarily the end of it, like it would be for us. We cremate them, and we put them in the ground, we cremate them, and then that's it. We don't deal with them again. But in their case, they did. They dealt with their bodies again, and the whole process could go on for a while. So this guy is basically putting family matters ahead of kingdom matters, and that's not a good thing. You're not supposed to do that. That's not to say you're supposed to ignore your family, or that your family is not supposed to be important. It is. But the kingdom is supposed to be the most important. Here's an example of that from the law. This is Deuteronomy chapter 13. Deuteronomy 13, at the beginning of the chapter, it talks about not following prophets who tell you to obey other gods. It says at the beginning of chapter 13 in Deuteronomy, if a prophet comes along and tells you the future or tells you your fortune and it comes true. Now, one of the tests of a prophet is that what he says doesn't come true. But in this case, we're saying, okay, if a prophet tells you something and then what he tells you comes true, okay, but then he goes on to say, let's worship another god, and he's a false prophet. And then it goes down to say in chapter 13, Deuteronomy 13, starting in verse 6, it says, if your very own brother, or your son, or daughter, or the wife you love, or your closest friend, secretly entices you, saying, let us go and worship other gods, gods that neither you nor your fathers have known, gods of the peoples around you, whether near or far, from one end of the land to the other. And remember, Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, you can't serve both God and money. So these gods don't have to be idols, per se. These gods don't have to be the kind of idols that you make into little statues and put on your family shrine in your living room. At this point in time, in Jesus' point in time, they weren't doing that anymore. The Jews of Jesus' day weren't doing that anymore. They were doing it back here. Moses had to deal with that. Many later generations of Israelite leaders had to deal with that. In Jesus' day, that is no longer a problem. They legitimately are no longer bowing down to man-made sculptures that they put on in their family shrines in their living rooms and worshiping those. They're not doing that anymore. But they are still worshiping things like money, or they're putting higher priorities ahead of them like family. So if that happens, if your closest friend, if the wife you love, if anyone in your family tells you to do that, do not yield to him or listen to him. Show him no pity. Do not spare him or shield him. You must certainly put him to death. Your hand must be the first to putting him to death, and in the hands of all the people. Stone him to death, because he tried to turn you away from the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Then all Israel will hear and be afraid, and no one among you will do such an evil thing again. So the point now, Jesus is not repeating the command to stone somebody who is doing such things, but he is saying put God first, put the kingdom first. And again, it's possible this man's father was still alive. He may have just been using that as an excuse to say, I'll get around to it someday, Jesus. I'll get around to it whenever my father dies, whenever I finish whatever business I'm currently conducting. Just not right now. Then he got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. Because remember, he said he was going to do that. He said to go across the lake. We read about this in Mark as well. Without warning, a furious storm came up over the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, Lord, save us, we're going to drown. He replied, Oh, you of little faith, why are you so afraid? Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. The men were amazed and asked, What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. Remember what Jesus said at the end of the Sermon on the Mount? Therefore, anyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had foundations on the rock. Jesus is in control of the winds and the waves. If your house is built on him, you will stand, because your foundation is on the one who controls the winds and the waves. Now this little section here that we just got done reading is in between these accounts of these healings that Jesus does here in Matthew 8 and 9. We want to think about chronology. We want to think about timelines. We want to think about what order and in what order the events of these Gospels happened. Okay, Matthew is not concerned about that. Matthew is arranging his narrative around themes and purposes. So these chapters 8 and 9, as we divide them, because Matthew didn't have chapters 8 and 9 here, are divided into 3 sections of 3 healings each, and they're split by these sections about fellowship and discipleship, following Jesus in discipleship. We have the healing of the leprosy, the leprous man. We have the healing of the centurion. We have the healing of Peter's mother-in-law and the crowds. Okay, those are the 3 groups of healings. And then we had the fellowship, or the fellowship, the discipleship teachings from, in these last set of verses, trusting Jesus, following him. Now we're going to have 3 more miracles and teachings, of healings, and then more about teachings about discipleship, and then 3 more miraculous healings. That's how Matthew has arranged this stuff. He has not arranged this stuff in chronological order in terms of when these events happened. Okay, that is simply not Matthew's purpose. It is not his point. He is not concerned about that. He is not focused on that. He is not worried about that. He doesn't consider that to be important. So we shouldn't either. So we read this stuff, and the actual arrangement that Matthew has put this in, we don't see it at all. It just glosses over us completely. It just flies by us completely. because we want it to be arranged in narrative form from start to finish, like a series of events that happened, and that is simply not the way Matthew is seeing this. And we have to learn to see it like he did, because he's the one who wrote the book. When he arrived at the other side of the region of the Gadarenes, whatever that is, in the notes it says Gerasenes or Gerasenes, whatever. It's somewhere on the southeastern side of the Sea of Galilee. This is Gentile territory. 2 demon-possessed men came coming from the tombs to meet him. They were so violent that no one could pass that way. Now, in Mark and Luke, this is one guy. Matthew adds another guy for reasons that no one can fully explain or understand. There may have been 2 of them. Matthew may be exaggerating for the sake of hyperbole, because we have seen that before. Again, that was considered okay. In the Old Testament, we saw examples of numbers being inflated in some cases to make a hyperbolic example. Jesus himself used hyperbole. That may not be. We see that as being a serious inaccuracy or an error. Matthew may not have seen it that way, and the people he's speaking to may have not seen it that way. Or there may have been 2 men, and only one of them became prominently known afterwards. I don't know. No one does. I mean, on the end, no one does. What you'll find most times, people trying to explain the difference between the 2 versus the 1, is that there were 2 guys, but one of them became more well-known or more well associated with the story, and Matthew is preserving there really were 2. I think it's possible that Matthew was just making it that there were 2. But again, even if he's doing that in his mind, that may not be a problem. I don't know. Because, again, and we saw a little bit of this in the Old Testament, the idea of inflating numbers for the sake of making a point was not considered a problem in the ancient world of writing as much as it is today. So that, I don't know. And neither do you, honestly. No one really knows. At any rate, the story is in Mark and Luke, and Matthew will include it here too, although, as usual, he will abbreviate it and not include as many details, because he's not as focused in the story itself as much as he is presenting it in the context of his overall message about Jesus. So, 2 demon-possessed men came coming from the tombs to meet him. They were so violent that no one could pass that way. "What do you want with us, Son of God?" they shouted. "Have you come here to torture us before the appointed time?" These are the demons speaking. It's through the mouths of the men, apparently. Some distance from them, a large herd of pigs was feeding. The demons begged Jesus, "If you drive us out, send us into that herd of pigs." We read in the other accounts that they were afraid Jesus would send them into the pit. They didn't. They know they're going to end up there someday, eventually. They know they're going to be punished someday for all their crimes, all their sins, all their rebellion. And they were afraid Jesus was going to do it right then and there. He was there to send them into hell or the abyss or whatever right then and there. And so they begged him instead to send them into these pigs. And he said to them, "Go." Now, personally, I would have preferred him to send them into the pit. I would have preferred him to say, "Get down into the lower ranks of Tartarus right now." But he didn't. He said, "Go." So they came out and went into the pigs, and the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and died in the water. I'm assuming the demons then left and went somewhere else. They wouldn't have died in the water with the pigs. Those tending the pigs ran off, went into the town, and reported all this, including what had happened to the demon-possessed men. Then the whole town went out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they pleaded with him to leave their region. Not everyone is going to appreciate what Jesus is trying to do for them. So Jesus stepped into a boat, crossed over, and came to his own town, that's Capernaum. Some men brought to him a paralytic lying on a mat. We read about this in Mark as well. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Take heart, son, your sins are forgiven." At this, some of the teachers of the law said to themselves, "This fellow is blaspheming. No one can forgive sins unless it's God alone." So he would be blaspheming if that's true, actually. If Jesus is not who he says he is, if Jesus is not who his followers say he is, then he is blaspheming here. If he forgives sins without being God, without having the authority to actually do so, then yes, he is blaspheming. So what's Jesus going to say about this? Knowing their thoughts, Jesus said, "Why do you entertain evil thoughts in your hearts?" Now he may have read their minds, or he may have been able to just tell what they were thinking because he knows what they think about him, and maybe he could read on their faces. I don't know. I really don't. There are instances where it seems like Jesus could read people's minds, and then there are instances where it seems like he didn't. I don't know. I don't know what happened in this case. I think it wouldn't have been all that difficult to guess what these men would have been thinking, knowing their attitudes towards Jesus already, and probably their facial expressions and their body languages. I don't know. Which is easier? So he's giving them a thought experiment. And he did it this way intentionally to provoke this reaction in them. He goes about healing this man in this way, specifically to make a point to the people who are watching. And so he's going to do that. He's going to say, ask them, which is easier? To say, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up and walk. But, so that you may know the Son of Man, he's identifying himself as that right here, has authority on earth to forgive sins. So I said the guy's sins are forgiven. How do you know that's true? If I say it, how can you see that? How do you know that your sins are forgiven if someone just tells you that? Well, he's going to show you. Then he said to the paralytic, get up, take your mat, and go home. And the man got up and went home. I guess he took his mat too at the same time. And when the crowd saw this, they were filled with awe. And they praised God who had given such authority to men. So he has proven his authority to forgive sins by showing that he can. Now, in this case, it appears as though this man's condition, paralyzed, lying on a mat, is connected to his sin. In other instances, Jesus will say that this isn't because of sin. Like, no one sinned to cause this man to be blind or whatever. It just happened. He was born blind for the sake of God's purposes. In this case, however, it seems as though the man's condition was a direct result of some sin he had. So Jesus forgave him of his sin first, and then showed that he had the authority to do so by removing the consequences of that sin and telling him to get up and walk. The problem the priests had, or the teachers of the law had, was that Jesus is claiming divine authority to forgive sin, because no one can actually forgive sin except for God. Now, you can forgive your brother when he sins against you, but you're not actually removing his sin. You are promising not to hold his sin against him, and you're dealing with him any longer. But you yourself don't have the authority to remove his sin. That's God's prerogative alone to do that. You are supposed to forgive your brother when he sins against you, but that does not mean your forgiveness of his sin against you does not mean that his sin is actually forgiven in God's sight. Only God can actually remove that man's guilt. Or yours. So Jesus did it this way to demonstrate his authority to do that, and thus demonstrate that he is not blaspheming when he forgives men their sins on earth. Because he, as God, as the Son of Man, as God has the authority on earth to do that. So apparently this man's condition was a result of his sin. Apparently, I don't know what. None of the accounts of this in the Gospels go into the detail of exactly what that was, but apparently there was a connection there. In some cases there is not. And Jesus makes that clear too. Sometimes there is no connection between your condition and sin. But sometimes there is. Because sin does bear consequence. Sin does have consequences. And so sometimes you end up in a predicament that is a direct result of your sin. Sometimes you end up in a predicament that's a direct result of somebody else's sin. Sometimes you end up in a predicament that's not a direct result of anybody's sin. Either God is testing you, or Satan is tempting you, or Satan is attacking you. But in this case, it does seem as though this man's condition was a result of some undisclosed sin. Or unreported in the Gospels, at least.